Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Propagandacast feature with me, a host Imperial Dane, here to talk about Total War Warhammer. And of course, some of you are already probably wondering then, why the bloody hell are we looking at Total War Attila? And that's because I rather think in some regards these games will have something in common here. In part, we already got the sort of darker tone of Attila, another world, hordes coming in from some other place. They're terrible, they're violent, and they've got chosen warriors too. Dun dun dun. I mean, that regard, there's a lot of sort of themes there. I think they'll sort of be repeating. Of course, Total War Warhammer will be taking that and cranking it up to 11. But still, some thoughts there, as again, some recurring themes, some recurring features, and also some other bits I'll be talking about a bit later into this video. Overall, this will be talking about what we know, and then some further speculation based then on what we know, which is also in part based on Attila, which again is why I'm bringing this up. So, what does that actually mean for us? What do we know specifically? Well, we know there'll be 4 playable races, and note, races, not faction, races. They rather specify that, and there's also some bits there that sort of hinted that there'll basically then be factions within these races. And again, that's going to be something I'll further go into depth with, but overall, each race, each faction there will have their own sort of legendary leader. If we saw Karl Franz, there's talk of Manfred von Karstein, the latest of the Karsteins, or the greater ones anyways. I can't remember the orcs' names, and then of course the High King Thorgrim Grutchbearer for the dwarves. So we already there'll be that. Of course, there's also Chaos, but that rather seems to be sort of playing the role, well, not of Attila as such. I mean, because he's basically playable at the moment. Of course, Chaos might be, but initially it seems like it's not. It's rather sort of, I suppose, more the Mongol, specifically Tamerlane there, and the specifics down in Medieval 2, basically non-playable sort of adversarial foe. They'll just sort of arrive in one huge wave and sort of try to push you off the map. And that's not to say Chaos couldn't happen as a more playable faction. That is basically someone, I mean, Chaos isn't exactly unified. You could play as, one devoted to another god, or just sort of not specific, and then of course, they'd be fighting on who's the top dog, and then who gets to sort of crush the Empire and the rest of the world. I mean, that could very well be an option, but overall, sort of there initially, that's what it is. Also note there, it's not going to play into the end times for those who know it, which is basically sort of a huge wrap-up party essentially for the old Warhammer Fantasy world. And in that regard, for Games Workshop, it's essentially dead, which I suppose is also why to a certain extent Creative Assembly gets to play around with it. But basically otherwise, dead, gone, no more. But again, that's not what's going to be happening in Total War Warhammer. It's before all of that, so don't have to worry about that one. Also, it's going to be a trilogy, which of course sounds pretty interesting to sort of announce a strategy game like Total War as, but basically it's going to be sort of, like additions with, of course, races and new terrain. So, for example, they might have one part, which of course will be Europe, or at least a chunk of Europe, then they'll add another one, and then a third one, and then basically they'll sort of, once you got all 3, I suppose, games, and the other 2, they'll basically be standalones as well. But if you got them all 3, you'll then be able to sort of play on one huge map. It might sort of be a bit like Empire, where there's sort of disconnect, you sort of have to switch, but still huge tracts of land, basically massive amounts of territory. So of course there might also be some rather long turns, so they're going to have to figure that one out. Otherwise there might be some slight problems there, but otherwise it could be pretty impressive. So we know that flying units will also be in. They pretty much confirmed that one. We also know it won't affect the historical side. That is, they've got several teams working on things, and they've already got teams that are working on the next historical Total War games. They've also got a team specifically for developing stuff for Attila, so it won't hurt any sort of DLC there or patches. That's also done, so no worries there. And of course, there'll be some still panicking, like a lemming in a hamster wheel. But wait, that's as well sort of, in the known department business. Beyond that, things get a little less clearer as such, of course. I mean, they aren't giving out that many details. It's all sort of the major parts. It'll be out for Windows, the Steam operating system, and Mac as well, basically. And there's also sort of, a bunch of other bits, like they made a ton of content. It's all about, focusing rather. They want to get into depth, which again is always going to be some other parts we're going to get to explain why that might then work out. But overall, again, that's where we've also come in looking at Attila, because again, I think there'll be some bits here playing in. Probably not religion. I mean, corruption, I could imagine, sort of more of a chaos-specific mechanic, though. Something you have to worry about to weed out, otherwise you might face up uprisings, mutants, and who knows what other kinds of horrors. Diseases, of course, could also play nicely, something you have to combat there. Food could easily also becomes mechanic. I mean, there's a lot of things there and the Chaos Moon Maw Sleeve on top of everything. I mean, there's going to be certainly some potential there. And certainly also the way that the factions, so certainly well, the overall factions, play a bit more differently. I mean, it's probably going to be taken even further, of course, with Total War Warhammer. But still, you know, the comparison, for example, between a Horde faction and this, or, you know, otherwise, I mean, it's going to be something that could also give an indicator that things are going to be different. Notably so. And I could imagine, for example, also, you know, some all of this will be playing faction politics. I imagine in particular that's the Empire, but also the Vampire Counts could be a pretty, you know, big things with the Orcs. I mean, it's basically who's the biggest, who's the boss. So there, it's probably not going to be such a huge issue. For example, otherwise, you know, also the siege mechanics, you know, as the fight progresses, towns will look worse, but also barricades. And that could in fact probably play out pretty cool there with handgunners and like wires holding up things. I mean, there's going to be some things here sort of playing in from Attila. But always sort of the more oppressive throne, and probably as the campaign progresses, things will get worse overall in the world. Nasty events will keep occurring, and I suppose also resources will begin to dwindle in. So there are going to be some factors there, sort of from Attila playing in, and again, you know, Attila is a sort of a nice foretaste for Total War Warhammer, which was something I honestly always expected once I sort of saw the initial announcement of Attila. Rather saw, you know, that might be preparation for Total War Warhammer. Or Total Warhammer, whatever you like to call it. So those are probably going to be some factors there playing in. But then you might be turning one specifically, well, what about races and factions? And, as I'll just switch over to sort of the next bit I want to show, we'll talk a bit further about that, because that's where I think things will probably get a bit more interesting. In some regards, of course, some will go a bit, oh no. But let's have at it. And here we go, at the selection screen, and you're wondering, well, what about this? And again, that's where you should... Again, the part where I talked about races, but then factions within these races are going to be playing in, because I think that rather is where sort of Attila nicely sort of displays. I mean, you got all of these sort of overall cultures, but then you have factions within these cultures, and that's probably, I think, where Total War Warhammer is sort of going to play into things. That is, so you get all the races, that is the main sort of armies within, but of course, not all factions are going to be sort of initially available. I mean, some might be unlocked sort of for free, others, of course, will be paid for downloadable content. I mean, that's there to say, and no point really complaining about it now. But again, it's probably not like they're going to be locking an entire race. I mean, of course, Chaos, I suppose, could end up somehow. But then again, a part of me would say even then they'd probably leave some part of it for free, and then a large part of the sub-faction. But it's probably also how it's going to work best. I mean, overall, you know, you might have different provinces of the Empire, different sort of clans within the Vampires. You know, you've got the Von Carstens and the Lamians. I can't bloody well remember the other names. I mean, I'm not really that huge on vampires, personally. I'm more about large empires, crushing oppression, beating out all the other ones. But that, of course, is for another time. I mean, you can also get the Orcs, different clans, you know, even some of the ones that probably more specifically represent goblins. As, I mean, they are more goblin-independent clans. And, of course, you also get the Orcs, Black Orcs. And of course you finally got the, oh bloody hell, dwarves with all their sort of different clans again. That's also probably where they talked about sort of going to depth, and that's also probably to an extent, you know, why they've moved on, that is Game Workshop, because they can sort of invent a bit few things, sort of get a bit more granular without also having to worry about, you know, well, this and that might contradict this. Again, it's game over, so to a certain extent, of course, as long as it doesn't get, you know, completely out of whack, they can probably have some leeway in what they want to do. And again, that's probably where I predict again the vast majority of downloadable content will happen. I mean, of course, there'll be sort of your larger expansions with full sort of races added in, but in between you'll probably sort of minor factions. And the only time where there might be sort of full sort of things sort of happening is probably going to be the ones that aren't specifically already armies in Warhammer Fantasy. That is, all these smaller nations you don't really hear anything about. Border Princes, Tilea, Istaria, basically equivalents of Spain, and Italy for those who don't know. Things like that are probably sort of might be things Creative Assembly could explore as well, and they're probably also going to be the ones easiest because they're basically all humans, and of course that's also why things are probably a lot more limited in terms of races and overall armies, because, well, when it comes to all this, of course, you can do a lot of sort of different human armies easily, but when it comes to sort of using orcs, vampires, dwarves, you know, things get a bit more tricky, plus dragons and giants, and there's probably ogres in there too, and I wouldn't be surprised if a halfling popped in. So I mean, there's a lot more to work with in that regard. rule again, and this is sort of how I predict things will look out for sort of Total War Warhammer. A lot of sort of different races, but then sort of smaller sub-factions. So, you know, you might play out as Reichland initially, then later on, you know, Ostland, Averland, Ostmark, and so on, for example. And that's the vampires, maybe they're from Carsteins initially, and then you'll try out someone else later on, and with the orcs, maybe, you know, the big bad ones, and then later on, maybe another game, you know, goblins. Sort of for trying out different things, but still, for example, maybe sticking still to it. And of course, at the same time, the traits will, of course, also play into it. So, I mean, there's a sort of few indicators again from Attila, I think, in sort of what directions we'll probably expect Total War Warhammer to go, and also, you know, objectives will probably also play a role here. Also, the minor objectives that's usually, for example, you know, do this and this, get a small reward. They have, for example, talked about, you know, quest lines as like for the legendary leaders, so there'll probably also be something there, sort of keep different people occupied with different things. But overall, again, that's pretty much all we know, and that's also pretty much, you know, how far the initial speculation can take us. I mean, there'll probably be more content coming out soon. I mean, this seems like a very well thought out thing. First cinematic, then shortly after videos, screenshots, and so on, and then sort of, you know, quickly keeping our attention until the game releases. I mean, that's a short, sweet marketing campaign, which I think is overall sort of a bit more preferable, rather than sort of languishing, you know, half a year between, you know, getting anything at all. But hopefully this has gotten people, you know, a bit, you know, clearer on what maybe to expect, what can happen. Of course, also just get some of the more further details on what we definitely know, but of course also some ideas on what might happen. And certainly also an idea, if you haven't already tried an Attila, you know, give it a go. I'm certainly enjoying it, but again, even then, you know, it might in some ways give you an indicator of what to expect. Of course, it's probably not going to be all the same. Of course, there'll probably be some large differences, but I still think there are some ideas there. So anyways, thank you all for watching. Hope you learned something, hopefully enjoyed it. And if you did, you know, feel free to subscribe to the YouTube channel, like it, share it with everyone. This is Imperial Engine. Cheers, and thank you all for watching. Bye.